This second part of this week's talks are around the brain and its structure. So the brain is made up of essentially three parts: the cerebrum, which coordinates thought, memory, learned behavior, and the higher mental functions; the cerebellum, which is responsible for coordinated muscle movement and balance; and the brainstem, which controls involuntary activities in the autonomic nervous system. So the cerebellum is all of this area. The cerebrum is all of this area. The cerebellum is this area, and then in here is the brainstem. So the cerebrum has the higher functions shown here, and we had mentioned in the first part that the gray matter is made up of neuron cell bodies. The white matter is the axons and supportive glial cells. The cerebrum is divided into two halves. One half is the left half, which controls essentially the higher logical functions, and then the right half, which controls the more artistic functions. The left half of the brain actually controls, in a motor respect, the right half of the body, and vice versa. Between the two halves is the longitudinal fissure, which is right here, and it divides the left and the right hemisphere. And then connecting the left and the right hemisphere is this area right here known as the corpus callosum, which is white matter connection between the two halves. So as I said, the left half controls the higher sort of scientific, logical functions, mathematics, senses of time, and language. The left half, or the right half, is more creative, artistic, intuitive, and imaginative. The outer aspect is known as the cerebral cortex, and we said this is made up of the bodies of the cells in the brain. And then the inner part, this is deeply convoluted, and this deep convolution, as shown here, increases the surface area for the gray matter, which is where all the neuron bodies are. The regions of the brain are called lobes, and there are several regions of the brain. The first of these is called the frontal lobe, which is in the front of the brain. It is the center of personality, judgment, and self-control. The motor area is also in the frontal lobe and controls voluntary movement. This motor area is on the left side of the brain. The parietal lobe analyzes sensory input and sends that analysis to the various parts of the brain for use. And then the occipital lobe controls the visual area. Lastly, the temporal lobe is in charge of hearing, taste, and smell. Now, there are various ways the cerebrum can be damaged. The one that's most commonly spoken about is called cerebral palsy. And this is damage principally to the motor cortex that is caused by a lack of oxygen during childbirth and usually arises shortly after birth. The cerebellum is the area of muscular coordination in the body, and the cerebellum is also divided into two hemispheres with a gray matter area and a white matter area. The complex muscle coordination is handled by the cerebellum. The third aspect is the brainstem, shown here. The brainstem is the connection between the brain and the spinal cord, and it controls a lot of the more basic functions of the body. The medulla oblongata, which is this area down here, regulates breathing, heartbeat, blood pressure, and various other survival functions. The pons, which is this large area here, it links the cerebrum to the cerebellum and coordinates eye movement and facial movement. That's these spinal nerves here and up here. And then the midbrain, which is in here, coordinates eye movements again and pupillary responses, as well as other basic functions. Now, within the pons is an area known as the reticular formation, and the reticular formation is what's called the master switch of the cerebrum. It essentially controls your level of consciousness. The limbic system is an area of the brain, shown in this area right in here, which generates emotional responses. And the various parts of the limbic system are important to this emotional response. The thalamus, which is right here, takes in the sensory input and routes sensory input throughout the brain, and also routes activation throughout the brain from the reticular activating system. The hypothalamus, I've mentioned in the past, it controls automatic functions such as temperature, hunger, thirst, and the physical effects of emotion, including the changes in heart rate, changes in the feeling of well-being, things of that nature. And then the third part is the hippocampus, which processes memories. The hippocampus is right here. And then lastly, the amygdala, which is right here, which is important in emotional generation and processing emotional forms of memory. What about the mind versus the brain? Behaviorism is the idea that a person's actions can be completely explained as responses to specific stimuli. The person that was responsible for behaviorism was B.F. Skinner. And in his experiments, he tried to show that all responses that a person did were responses to specific stimuli. For example, if you rang a bell and produced food, then the person's mouth would water because of the food, and then you could train them such that when they heard the bell, even without the production of food, their mouth would begin to water, and various other things. And B.F. Skinner tried to use that as a way of treating mental illness. In other words, you could control the person's actions by modulating the responses to stimuli. If a person had problems, say, with anger, you could train them not to become angry when presented with stimuli that previously caused anger, etc. But what ended up happening was that it became clear that the physical brain and the physical brain's responses to stimuli were not the same as the mind. And a person's mind was completely separate from the physical brain. This is another way of saying that a person's soul is separate from their physical brain.